This is a story of greed, corruption, and hubris. It might sound familiar, but if you think money and power are the sources of conflict in this story, well, I guess you would be half right. Water. It's a fundamental human need, but access to a safe, consistent source of water is not always easy or guaranteed. From 1900 to 1930, the city of Los Angeles, California, went from a small town of 102,000 residents to a booming urban metropolis of over 1.2 million. But how does a city with only one primary source of fresh water, the historically unpredictable Los Angeles River, support a population nearly 1,000% beyond its capacity? The answer is to undertake an engineering feat of epic proportions, one that would be rooted in lies and underhanded business dealings. A 233-mile aqueduct over desolate, mountainous terrain, costing over $626 million in today's dollars. In this video, we'll take a look at the key players of the Los Angeles Aqueduct project, how their motivations and decisions from over 100 years ago shaped the city of Los Angeles as we know it, and some of the disastrous consequences that linger to this day. Our story begins in 1867, when the Southern Pacific Railroad laid a branch line to Los Angeles, linking the city to the rest of the country. In 1884, San Bernardino Valencia oranges debuted at the World's Fair in New Orleans, and California became the envy of aspiring citrus farmers. By the following year, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad linked Los Angeles to Kansas City. This created competition with the Southern Pacific that led to a drastic decrease in the cost of a rail ticket to Los Angeles. Just 5 years later, in 1890, the population of Los Angeles jumped to 50,395. 2 years later, an oil boom in the city attracted tens of thousands of prospectors, and by 1900, the city's population doubled to over 100,000 residents. In spite of the success and new fortunes going around, the city was racing full speed toward the brink of disaster. It was quickly running out of water to support the rapidly increasing population, and possibly only 2 men took notice. This brings us to the 2 main characters in our story, William Mulholland and Frederick Eaton. And if you've ever driven the 21-mile Mulholland Drive through the eastern Santa Monica Mountains, then you've definitely heard of the former. William Mulholland was born in Belfast, Ireland, and began a career at sea when he was just 15 years old. He ended up in Los Angeles in 1877 at the age of 22, and shortly thereafter was hired as a ditch digger for the Los Angeles City Water Company by its 22-year-old superintendent, Frederick Eaton. Mulholland and Eaton became close friends, so close that when Eaton left the water company to pursue political ambitions, Eaton named Mulholland as the new superintendent. In 1898, Fred Eaton was elected mayor of Los Angeles after running on a platform of bringing a new water supply to the city. The following year, voters passed a $2 million bond measure to purchase the private Los Angeles City Water Company, and in 1902, it became the municipally owned Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Mulholland was retained as the superintendent, mostly because a formal schematic of the city's water system did not exist on paper, but rather in Mulholland's head. With Los Angeles facing a very real and imminent threat of running out of water, Fred Eaton and William Mulholland began a scandalous endeavor of securing new sources of water for the city, and Eaton had his eye on a river over 200 miles away. Today, Owens Lake is a mostly dry lake, but up until 1913, It covered an area of 108 square miles and had an average depth between 23 and 50 feet. Located in the southern portion of Owens Valley, Owens Lake was the terminus of the Owens River and an integral part of the region's ecosystem, providing an important feeding and resting stop for millions of migratory waterfowl. Owens Lake existed for tens of thousands of years, but in just 11 short years between 1913 and 1924, it completely disappeared. Fred Eaton had recalled seeing the Owens River and Owens Lake on a camping trip in the area years prior and made up his mind that they would be the answer to his rapidly growing city's dwindling water supply. Despite being 233 miles away, a delivery system between the Owens Valley and Los Angeles wouldn't require any electricity whatsoever. Since Owens Valley is located at roughly 4,000 feet above sea level, and Los Angeles only 285 feet, the water could freely flow downhill under its own pressure in an aqueduct. By 1904, after Eaton had convinced his friend William Mulholland that the Owens River was the best option, the only thing that stood in their way was the law. Now, in 1904, the newly created United States Bureau of Reclamation was in the planning stages of building its own irrigation system in the Owens Valley to help local farmers. If built, this system would effectively put an end to Mulholland and Eaton's aspirations of diverting the Owens River to Los Angeles, so the two knew they had to act quickly. This brings us to the third character in our story, Joseph Lippincott, the regional engineer in charge of the Bureau of Reclamation's Owens Valley project. Now, try to stay with me because this is where things start to get a little shady. It just so happens that Eaton and Lippincott were close associates. Eaton got Lippincott to hire him as a consultant on the Owens Valley project, giving Eaton unfettered access to important information like land ownership and water rights in Owens Valley. Information that would prove beneficial to Los Angeles if it wanted to take the valley's water, which it did. In return, Eaton hired Lippincott as a private consultant for the city of Los Angeles, paying him twice his annual Bureau of Reclamation salary. Now, in his role as a private consultant, Lippincott provided Los Angeles with valuable information on how to go about obtaining water rights in the Owens Valley. Eaton and Mulholland quickly got to work buying up land and water rights in the valley. Eaton personally purchased prime ranch lands for himself near the Owens River and turned over his new water rights to Los Angeles. The city's land grabs eventually received the support of US President Theodore Roosevelt, who signed a bill granting Los Angeles rights of way across federally owned land in the Owens Valley. The city of Los Angeles soon owned 90% of the water in the valley, effectively blocking the Bureau of Reclamation from proceeding with its own irrigation project for good. But now for the hard part, convincing Angelenos to pay for the aqueduct. Crooked Politics 101. The quickest and easiest way to earn support for an unfathomably expensive project is to fabricate a crisis and then present your solution as the only viable option. And it is believed that this is exactly what Mulholland did. Starting in 1905, the LADWP allegedly began dumping the city's reservoirs into the Pacific Ocean, and then blamed the resulting shortage of water on a drought. Mulholland's later excuse for dumping the water was that the city was merely flushing the system. In either case, the public bought it, and by 1907, two bond measures passed allowing the city to spend upwards of $26 million on the new aqueduct project. However, under its city charter, the city of Los Angeles wasn't allowed to incur a debt greater than 15% of its assessed value. This project would put them well over that limit. Additionally, Mulholland favored the neighboring San Fernando Valley's aquifer, which would provide free water storage without evaporation. But the Los Angeles City Charter also prohibited its water from being sold, leased, or used outside of the city without 2/3 voter approval. Mulholland secretly figured out a way to solve both of these problems in one fell swoop, annexing the San Fernando Valley. In doing so, the city would instantly expand by over 100,000 acres, increasing its assessed valuation, thereby raising its debt limit and allowing for storage of its new water. And here we go again with the shady business dealings. You see, anybody with knowledge of the plans to annex the San Fernando Valley stood to make a lot of money, And they did. A small group of wealthy investors, later known as the San Fernando Land Syndicate, included people like Harrison Otis, who was the publisher of the Los Angeles Times, and Henry Huntington, a railroad magnate, both friends of former Mayor Fred Eaton, who gave them inside information. This syndicate purchased cheap tracts of San Fernando Valley land in 1905, with the knowledge that it would soon become prime, well-irrigated Los Angeles real estate. Construction began on the Los Angeles Aqueduct in 1908, and it was a massive undertaking. At one point, the city had over 6,000 men on the payroll, and 3 cement mills, which now lay in ruins, were built in Owens Valley. Beginning at the intake located north of Owens Lake between the towns of Independence and Big Pine, Owens River water now begins its 233-mile journey on the Los Angeles Aqueduct through sections of open-lined and unlined canal, covered concrete conduit, concrete tunnels, and steel siphons until it ends up at the Cascades in Sylmar and into the Upper Van Norman Reservoir. There it is, take it. These were the only 5 words Mulholland uttered to Mayor H.H. Rose when water began flowing down the Cascades for the first time at the aqueduct's opening ceremony on November 5th, 1913. But now that the aqueduct was finally built, the city's problems were far from over. It's one thing to bring millions of gallons of water to a city, but without proper storage, it will all go to waste. Additionally, angry Owens Valley residents began dynamiting the new aqueduct. These acts of sabotage culminated in the events that took place on November 1st, 1924, when a mob of angry farmers drove to the aqueduct's emergency spillway channel in the Alabama Hills, opened the gates, and sent the entire volume gushing back into Owens Lake. However, the acts of vandalism quickly came to an end in 1928 after the Inyo County Bank collapsed, wiping out the lifetime savings of many farmers, which included payments from the sale of their homes and ranches to the city of Los Angeles. Eaton offered to sell a portion of his new ranch property to the city of Los Angeles for $1 million, knowing that his good friend Mulholland coveted its strategic location for a reservoir. Mulholland counteroffered at $500,000 and then slightly more, but Eaton refused. The deal fell through and the close friendship between the duo went sour. Out of spite, Mulholland spent the next several years and close to $1.3 million constructing the St. Francis Dam in San Francisco Canyon. Behind me is where St. Francis Dam once stood, towering 185 feet over the canyon floor. Completed on May 4th, 1926, St. Francis Dam created a new reservoir with a storage capacity of 38,000 acre-feet of water. It had the ability to supply Los Angeles with a steady flow of water in the event of a drought or natural disaster. However, there was just one problem. 2 days after opening, the dam started to crack and leak, problems that Mulholland wrote off as normal. Just about 2 years later, when the reservoir reached full capacity for the first time, the cracking and leaking intensified. And on the morning of March 12, 1928, Mulholland personally inspected the dam and once again signed a clean bill of health for the dam. Well, that night, just 2.5 minutes before midnight on March 12, 1928, St. Francis Dam catastrophically failed, sending 12.4 billion gallons of water gushing into the canyon below in a matter of minutes. It was the worst American civil engineering disaster in the 20th century, and the second greatest loss of life in California's history after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. In all, it is believed that at least 431 people perished in the St. Francis Dam disaster. Some victims were swept out to sea and never recovered. Some remains ended up as far south as the beaches of San Diego, and other remains were discovered as recently as 1994. Mulholland resigned 8 months after the disaster, and during the official coroner's inquest, he took full responsibility, stating that he envied the dead. A jury recommended that Mulholland not be held criminally responsible, but his reputation had been so irreversibly tarnished that he lived out the remaining 7 years of his life in seclusion. Fred Eaton lost most of his savings when the Inyo County banks collapsed, and was forced into selling his land to the LADWP out of necessity. Eaton moved back to Los Angeles in 1928, made amends with his old friend, and passed away in 1934, just 1 year before Mulholland. After completion of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, Joseph Lippincott entered private practice and jumped around serving on various water consulting boards until passing away in 1942 at the age of 78. In 1941, the LADWP eventually built the Long Valley Dam near Frederick Eaton's former ranch. The dam created Lake Crowley, a name that was purposely chosen to honor the memory of Father John J. Crowley, a Catholic priest known as the Desert Padre. Hailed as a local hero in the Owens Valley, Father Crowley helped keep the peace between angry residents of the valley and the LADWP by convincing residents that the Owens Valley could one day become a tourist destination. Los Angeles continued pumping more and more water out of the Owens Valley each year as the city expanded, and the valley's agriculture industry quickly died off. In the 1930s, Angelenos voted to expand the aqueduct further into the Mono Basin, which began draining yet another important body of water, Mono Lake. A second Los Angeles Aqueduct was built in the 1960s when the State Water Rights Board warned Los Angeles that it could lose its water rights if it didn't appropriate more water from the Owens Valley. In other words, Los Angeles wasn't taking enough water. This second aqueduct system further strained natural resources in the area, and Owens Lake eventually became the largest single source of dust pollution in the United States, dust that included dangerous carcinogens like cadmium, nickel, and arsenic. In 2001, the LADWP was compelled by a court order to begin shallow flooding portions of Owens Lake to combat the toxic dust pollution. Brine flies and waterfowl began returning to the lake, and the LADWP was praised for its environmental efforts, which is a little ironic seeing as some would say this is tantamount to Big Tobacco being praised for its anti-smoking programs. The LADWP extended an olive branch of sorts in recent years when a land art project materialized at the lake commemorating its environmental heritage. The installation is part of a larger Owens Lake master plan backed by stakeholders that include the LADWP and State Land Commission. Its goal is to control dust and create and protect the new habitat. At this point, only time will tell if the master plan is successful or not. The population of Los Angeles County is expected to increase by another 1 million people by the year 2060, which will undoubtedly put a further strain on the region's water delivery systems, and we could possibly see further expansion of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. So what's the answer here? How do we go about ensuring a stable water supply that will serve the city's growing population without further destroying our finite and natural resources? Before you go, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thanks for stopping by, and remember to never stop exploring.